Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. We are having our meeting for this week for the Police Accountability Board. It is October 21st, 2021. So I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order, and I'm going to have our executive director please do the roll call. Can't hear you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Board members, please say here or click the raised hand button on Zoom as I list your name for roll call. Arlene Brown.
Here.
Reverend Ricky Harvey. Bob Harrison.
Here.
Dr. Celia McIntosh. Reverend Matthew Nikoloff. Ida Perez.
Here.
Rabbi Settle. Vice Chair Danielle Tucker. Chair Wilson.
All right, I'm also here. Okay. So we have a quorum, so we're going to proceed with tonight's meeting. So we're going to be trying to stick to Robert's rules tonight. So I appreciate everyone's patience as we try to follow the proper meeting procedure. So just as a reminder that we'll try to discuss and debate motions after they are made rather than beforehand, please. So before reviewing last week's minutes, I'd like to introduce our guest, Thomas Kim, who was one of the PAB's chief consultants working on our investigatory procedures. Thomas, thanks so much for being here. And we really look forward to you presenting to us tonight. So thanks for coming.
Chair Wilson, I'll just also note that Mina Malik is also with us tonight.
Oh, well, hello there. Hi. Okay. Hello.
Hi, Chair Wilson.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for being here. Okay. All right. And can we go ahead and move forward with showing the minutes from last meeting, please?
Members of the board, these are the minutes that were circulated earlier this week. They include one edit that was made and that was circulated on Wednesday. So folks should have had time to review this, but I'll scroll through slowly, give everyone a minute just to look at each page, give folks about 60 seconds to look at the first page, and then we'll move on to the next page.
And if there are any corrections to the minutes, please go ahead. And if there are no corrections, the minute stands approved.
I'm just going to give one more minute to scroll through the second page, Chair Wilson.
Great, thank you. Okay, are we all set? Okay, minutes are approved. Okay, excellent. So we can now move on to the staff report.
Was there a vote? Sorry, I may have missed the vote.
Oh, you can approve by unanimous approval.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's no corrections.
Okay, so we're going to now move on to the staff report.
Thank you, Chair Wilson. Again, for members of the public, I want to just introduce, Thomas Kim, Mina Malik. These are two of the consultants we've been working with to develop a framework for our policy and procedure. And they're going to be talking a little bit with us tonight, but this is a two-part report. I just want to first talk about one item that's come up a few times. It's about this state grant that we received, $500,000 from New York. Board members have asked about it. What's the process? Where are things going? Since last meeting, we met with the budget office here at the city, and we also had back and forth with officials at the state. We have submitted some information to the state that they requested about how we're going to be using the funds, et cetera. But we are waiting on a formal letter from the state to move forward to the next steps in terms of exchanging information back and forth and finalizing exactly how the grant will be used. I'll be keeping the board updated by email on this. We still have to wait for a little bit of specific restrictions that might come on the grant money, but again, it's waiting to hear from the Department of Criminal Justice Services at the state to see if there's any extra, wrinkles. But right now, it seems that we're going to have some flexibility in spending these funds, and we will make sure that they are spent appropriately. It just takes a little bit of time, receipt, and back and forth. So that's the first thing I wanted to let people know of, that the board is on top of this. Well, the second thing, and the more bigger picture of the report tonight, is to talk about a framework for the board's investigatory policies and procedures, and more specifically, how the board's going to fit into that framework as an entity, talking about the board members themselves. So I'm going to give a brief presentation on that framework tonight, with the hope that later in this meeting, the board may get a chance to vote to approve of this basic framework. And in doing so, allow the board to move forward with next steps in making sure that framework gets fleshed out and implemented, so that come the beginning of next year, the board can start doing the work that our community so desperately needs it to do. So I'm just going to give this presentation and then wait to the end for any questions on it. And just to emphasize, this is a framework that we've been working with consultants to come up with, even though I'll be the one presenting. And I'll just want to welcome Reverend Nikoloff, who just joined. So let me just get this pulled up here. Okay. So again, what's being proposed tonight is a framework for the board to consider. There are some alternatives here, and we're going to discuss them at the end, but we're going to start with is kind of the reason why we have to have a framework, and then what the framework is, talk about the alternatives, and wrap up of why we chose this one. We're presenting this one tonight. So the challenge that the board faces in creating its investigatory procedures is this. The city charter that Rochesterians overwhelmingly voted in 2019 to amend to create the Police Accountability Board creates a framework for how the board and the board members are supposed to go about investigating and addressing police misconduct. The issues are twofold. First, the charter creates a very high-level framework, but leaves a lot of the mid-level and fine-grained level details up to the board to determine. There's a lot of, the board is given the power to create rules and procedure to take that framework and make it live, right? So that's one of the things. That's part of the reason why you have to create investigatory procedure. But a second reason is the lawsuit filed by the Locust Club against the city that currently is suspending a lot of the Police Accountability Board's specific powers when it comes to discipline. Here's why that creates a challenge for the PAB. Under the original city charter vision, there was a clear kind of 4-step vision for how the board was supposed to approach police misconduct. The first step was that staff would receive complaints and tips and referrals about police misconduct. The staff would open investigations, conduct an investigation, write a report, and then move to the second phase you'll see on the screen and present that report to the board. The board as a whole would vote to determine whether or not to go to a formal disciplinary hearing. During that disciplinary hearing, a 3-member panel of the board, so 3 board members, would sit as essentially kind of judge/jury on that board, in that hearing, listen to the evidence, listen to all the testimony, and then they would come up with findings, making formal findings about what they think happened in an incident. And then the final step would be the panel would use a disciplinary matrix. That's a set of guidelines that say what consequences have to happen if a certain misconduct occurs. They would use that guideline to impose discipline, right? So just like a judge writes an opinion and then sentences someone, the board would make factual findings and then impose discipline on an officer. So, that was the original vision. This lawsuit has temporarily suspended the board's ability to do these three things. Because it suspends the board's ability to hold disciplinary hearings and impose discipline, the board's ability to vote to go into those hearings, to have the three-member panels who oversee the hearings, and then to impose discipline, the board can't actually do that right now. So even though the law says here's what the board's supposed to do, because that part of the law is suspended, the board's formal role isn't there anymore, right? So in the post-lawsuit process, the way things work is you still have that first step of the PAB staff doing the complaint intake and doing the investigation, writing up a report. But instead of going to the board, that report goes to the public and then to the chief of police. And the chief of police is the one who decides to hold a hearing. And instead of the hearing being overseen by the Police Accountability Board, the hearing would run according to state law and the police union contract, which says in most cases, and this is how it usually works, there's a couple options. I won't get into the details, but normally there's a hearing officer that the city and the locus club agree on. And that hearing officer presides over a hearing. They, listen to evidence, they listen to witnesses, and they come up with findings. And then the chief can look at the findings, look at all the evidence, look at the policies, look at the procedures, and the chief can impose whatever discipline they decide is necessary. So that's kind of where we're at with this process. And so, of course, it's up to the board to figure out how exactly we're going to do intake and investigation in ways that, make sure that we're transparent, quick, and fair, while also protecting officer due process rights. But we also have to figure out exactly how the board is still going to play a role in this work, particularly because the board still has the legal duty to create a disciplinary matrix, that set of guidelines, even if they aren't binding, even if they are merely recommendations. So again, it's this question of what role should the board members play? And when we think about this question, there are some things to consider, deciding on what role. The first is the mission. How can the board best be the community's voice in investigations? And we think about competency, what competency can board members have? What can they do best given their talents, training, and those legal limitations that kind of shape what the board can do? And also, what can the staff do best given this set of circumstances? And then, of course, time. How can board members play a role? How can their role be played while still being volunteers who have jobs and lives outside of the Police Accountability Board? We have staff for a reason. They can do a lot of full-time work. And how do we make sure that the board is doing the most important work while preserving their role as volunteers? And so after, talking to, a lot of stakeholders involved in this, speaking to, our consultants, speaking to staff, speaking to board members, talking to people who've been involved in this process, ultimately the decision is for the board to make. Staff can make recommendations about what the board, the framework for policy and procedure might look like. At the end of the day, it is the board's decision because the board's, runs this agency. And so this proposed framework is a 4-part one. The first part would be intake and case filing, receiving complaints, receiving tips, et cetera. Engaging with community members at that point of the process. That will be done by staff. The second part of the process of investigating those claims and making findings, coming up with a report that says, here's all the evidence, here's what the evidence says, and here's whether or not wrongdoing was committed based on the evidence. That again will be done by investigators, expert trained staff, attorneys. And then the third, kind of recommending consequences, being able to step in and say, given these facts, given these findings, here's what should happen. That role is for the board with some staff support. So it's the board's job to say, given these facts, here's what we think should happen. Even if board members can't force the police department to follow that recommendation, they can make that recommendation. And then finally, the fourth part of this framework is releasing the report and tracking the report, tracking the recommendations, tracking what the police department does so that the community can know whether or not the police department is following the PAB's recommendations. So, the key part of this proposal, this framework, is that the board plays that most important role in saying, here's what the community thinks should happen in the case of wrongdoing. So here's how we would, here's how this framework looks like on a step-by-step basis. And what I want to emphasize is that there's so many details to develop. The first most important step is to adopt a framework so that the staff and the board can work together to figure out what the details are going to look like. So there's going to be a lot of questions that you might have about deadlines and timelines and what specific staff members might perform a duty. A lot of these things will be figured out into the future once we know that this is the framework we're moving forward in. And I want to emphasize that this framework is all working within the rules of the city charter and the proposed framework there. And it also incorporates best practices and thoughts from other police accountability boards across the country. So again, that first step of intake and case filing, this will be performed by our case management unit, those case managers that we have, the deputy chief of case management. The first step would be processing and filing complaints, tips, and referrals. So, people might think complaints, tips, and referrals. I thought that, police oversight and civilian review is just about complaints. Well, the law says that the Police Accountability Board has to receive complaints and information generally from the public, whether it's, an anonymous tip about whether or not something's occurring in the police department, referrals from within the police department, referrals from elected officials. And the PAB has to have the ability to open investigations without a complaint at all. And so PAB has to do more than just accept complaints from specific members of the public. We have to accept all these different kinds of sources of information that can allow PAB to launch investigations. So you need a process for, taking these things in and then filing them. An important part of this process is having a hotline where people can call and call in and directly report to PAB. And we are working on hopefully getting a 24/7 completely language accessible hotline set up. And I'll be updating the board, keeping the board updated on our progress on getting that online as it happens. So that after processing and taking in this information, it's up to the case management unit to determine if an investigation is actually warranted. If there's enough facts to say, hey, there's a chance something bad happened here, and it's in our jurisdiction to investigate. So for example, if someone calls in with a complaint and says, hey, a Monroe County Sheriff's officer seemed to do something wrong, at that point we'd say, that's not in our jurisdiction because we can only investigate actions by Rochester Police Department officers, right? So you have to have it's essentially screening at this point. And then you would make the choice, if you're going to open the investigation, you'd have to formally open an investigation and then assign investigating teams to do the work. And that can be a bit of a complicated process, figuring out, how serious is the complaint and where does it need to go in terms of what team would be investigating? Is it our major case unit? Is it our, is it a different unit? And then providing post-filing notice and support. So the law says that PAB has to provide a bunch of information and support to people who file complaints with us, whether it's connecting them to certain legal services or providing them information about how to do certain things, like file a notice of claim against the city. And so the case management unit would do all of this as well. And what we're hoping is that our hotline could also be a tool for connecting people to social services, because lots of people who are dealing with potential police misconduct are also in crisis. And so we would love to have a hotline that could directly connect that to them. And so again, we're working hopefully with some existing systems to make that work. So after this first step, and again, it's led by the staff, the second step of investigating actually doing the investigations would be run by our investigations division. And the first step is to create an investigation plan, right? This is just a best practice, not just in police oversight boards, but in law enforcement agencies generally, of writing out the steps of what you have to do. Making sure that you can go check by check from, canvassing the scene for evidence to interviewing and following up with people who directly contacted the board, to going through the categories of evidence that you can collect, going through the categories of wrongdoing that could be possible. And there's making this as systematic and standardized as possible, while also making sure that you have individualized case management plans that are tailored to the specific facts of the case. And then the investigators go through and perform the investigatory steps, right? And what's great about the investigations plan is that it allows supervisors to kind of check off the box as people are going. This is a good point to step in and just say that PAB is going to have its own internal case management system, a set of software that allows all evidence, complaints, tips to be formally filed, organized, and set up under an investigation system. And that system, again, is for quality control, and allowing for investigators to track through the process. The dream is to have a case management system that also has a public portal, a front-facing public portal, where people can look up their complaint or tip number and can track and see how the investigation is going along. So as you perform the investigatory steps, you get through to the end of the investigation where you can say, okay, we've looked at enough evidence, we can make a determination about whether or not wrongdoing happened. And that would be, you draft and review an investigation report. So the investigator would draft it, and then there would be review by supervisors. And this part's really important, the investigations report, right? So I'm just going to give you an example of what one of these investigations reports might look like and what it might contain. So there would be a summary of facts in the investigation itself. Here's, did we get a complaint about this? Did we get a tip? Here's what we did in response to that. Here's what we looked at. Here's who we interviewed. Here's the laws and regulations that were at issue. Here were our findings. And then here's what we did. So, those findings would not just be on, was there wrongdoing? Did someone break the rules? Did someone break the law? But also if there were any potential systemic issues. And this is really important, right? Our investigators are not going to be policy analysts, right? They're not going to be looking at every situation and coming up with policy solutions based on what they see. But it's important for investigators to look at situations, and even where all of the rules might have been followed, all of the things might have been done by the book, investigators can still say, look, there seems to be something that's wrong here. There seems to be, everything was by the book here, but the training seems to be off. And so even if they followed training, it seems like there might be a training issue. Or there might be a finding that, there was some wrongdoing here in terms of racial bias, that, this was a racially motivated stop. And it seems like this isn't a one-off event. This may be a systemic issue in the department. It's important for the investigators to be able to have some space in the report to say that, because that's an important vision that I think the board has, is, looking at systemic issues and not just saying this is about bad apples, but always looking to the bigger picture. And again, giving the investigators a chance to say some of those things in the report can be an important way for PAB to fulfill its broader mission of systemic change. And then, of course, details on the evidence and legal analysis, et cetera. So not just having the summary there so people can read through, but also, having the ability to, in the full report, go through the evidence, the legal analysis, everything you need to have supervisors be able to do quality control, and for other people to take a look and say, okay, I get the summary, but let's look into the details. And then finally, referrals. The law requires the Police Accountability Board to make referrals as necessary when there is certain kinds of wrongdoing. So if there's criminal wrongdoing, right, you have to be able to go to either the Attorney General's office or the District Attorney's office to make referrals. There's other agencies that you'd want to make referrals to, like the New York State Department of Human Rights, if there's certain violations there. And another one, of course, and again, this is important, is a referral to our Policy and Oversight Division, right? So investigators, again, might not be able to dive into the details of policy issues, but if they think, hey, this is something that looks like there's a policy problem, they can make a referral to the Policy and Oversight Division to start looking into it at that systemic level. So that would be the investigation report, and after it's drafted and reviewed, there would be kind of two options. If there was no wrongdoing finding, there would be the case would be closed. You'd make any referrals that you'd need to. And you'd contact, obviously the involved parties to let them know about the finding. If there was wrongdoing found, though, they would make all necessary referrals, and then you would submit the investigation report to the board. And here's where that board role gets fleshed out. So, the board right now, during these meetings operates as a group of 9. In the city charter, oftentimes the board will operate in panels. In that vision that it's the work that the board's supposed to do under the full vision of the law, you have panels of 3 members, rotating panels to preside over hearings. Well, in this framework, you have the same thing. You have board panels, rotating 3-member panels that are constituted in advance of doing the work. And these board panels would function to use the guidelines about consequences in the case of officer wrongdoing. Again, this is called the disciplinary matrix, to select the consequences for what should happen in the case of wrongdoing. And of course, they would do this with staff support. And we'll explain exactly how in just a minute. And the important thing here too is, just like in the city charter's original vision, there have to be rules for recusal and absences, right? So if someone is going to determine a case where they know the officer, they know the people involved, they don't get to serve on that panel to make sure that no one thinks that there's any kind of improper influence here. And I'll say it's the same thing with investigators and all of our support staff. There will be recusal rules to make sure that there's no conflicts of interest there. And of course, we get to that third stage where these panels actually work. And again, the work will be performed by the board panels and staff support. So the first step would be, the panelists, that group of 3, whoever, is on deck for the next set of reports, they would review the reports. They would get them a paper copy. They would get them via email. And they would be able to review the reports and any, additional evidence or facts that were attached to the case. And after reviewing those reports as individuals, they would meet. They would come together and they would meet with investigatory staff present, and they could ask the investigators questions to learn more about the circumstances, the case, if they didn't understand something in the report. And then they would use the guidelines to vote on the consequences. And the guidelines might say that given X kind of wrongdoing, here's all these options for what could have happened. And the board would use those guidelines to determine what they think should be the board's recommendation. They would vote, make a determination, a majority vote, at least 2-1. And then, for serious cases of, no wrongdoing, the board would review and approve of the no wrongdoing report. Excuse me, that's an error that shouldn't be in this. But the point is that after the board does this second step, the panelists would submit their recommendation to the staff, and the staff would incorporate that recommendation into the report that will be released to the public. Okay. So the staff would, again, support the board through this process by helping them create the panels, helping them by sending them the reports, helping them understand the reports, and then helping them by bringing their recommendations and putting them into a final document. And then it would go to the fourth and final step, where there would be the reports release and tracking. This would again be performed by PAB staff. First, you'd contact interested and involved parties to let them know what was coming down the pipe. You would release the final report to the public and our PD. We'd have to release it on our website. And then if necessary, holding a press conference for high media visibility cases to make sure that there's as much information coming out as possible. And then maybe the most important step is tracking the RPD's response to the board's recommendations and findings. Is the chief going ahead and launching a formal hearings about this? Is the chief following the board's recommendations when it comes to discipline? So that the public can know if there's a gap between what the PAB is finding and what RPD is finding itself. So that's the framework. And that framework leaves us with a bunch of questions, but maybe the most pressing ones are this. First, what will be the consequences for kinds of wrongdoing? What are those guidelines that the board's going to be using and imposing? What will they be? And the second question is, how do board members want to address low-level cases without being overwhelmed? This is always an important issue, and I'm sure that Mina and Thomas can talk about it. But a way to have board work be slowed and people be overwhelmed is by having too many cases in the pipeline that people, it's clear what needs to happen sometimes. These are cases, many of the cases that the Police Accountability Board will review are cases like things like a first instance of an officer being disrespectful to a member of the public. And in those cases, it might be clear what needs to happen rather than the board necessarily having to deliberate over it. And so the board may want to deliberate over these cases, they may not. And so that's one of the questions that the board kind of has to answer. One way to answer both of these questions at the same time is for the board to create a kind of two-tier disciplinary matrix, a kind of two-category set of disciplinary guidelines. The photo on the screen is an example of disciplinary guidelines, a disciplinary matrix that was just created this year for the New York Police Department. That set of guidelines is exceptionally lengthy, very, very, very detailed, and it took them a lot of work to get that done. But it's an example of how more and more police departments and cities are coming up with these matrices, these guidelines to say exactly what should happen in the instance of officer wrongdoing. And so, these tiers would be broken up into the first tier, which is for significant wrongdoing. And, in cases like that, what this rubric, what this guideline would propose is a range of consequences, right? It's saying that in these instances of significant wrongdoing, the board needs to step in, the board needs to look at all the facts, have a highly fact-specific analysis, come together as a panel and say, here's what we think should happen using our judgment, using our understanding of all the facts. And so for the second tier of maybe lower level cases, these guidelines could give set consequences for a specific action. And the PAB staff could release the report without necessarily going to the board because the board members predetermined the corrective action through the guidelines. And in doing this, the board would decide what wrongdoings in the first tier and what wrongdoings in the second tier, and they decide what the consequences for all wrongdoing are. So at the end of the day, these guidelines, they would be truly of the board. And, if the board is going to move forward with this, likely of the community, because, creating these guidelines, the board by law has to work with the community and get input, as well as input from RPD and the Locust Club, the police union. And so, just an example of what this might look like. So for a tier 1 case, let's say that PAB investigators find that an officer intentionally turned their body-worn camera off during an arrest. In many other jurisdictions, this is a very, very, very serious offense because it goes to the heart of accountability by eliminating the evidence necessary to judge whether or not wrongdoing happened. So this is usually considered an extremely serious offense if it were to happen. And as much, let's say that the board created guidelines that labeled this as a tier 1 offense. And the guidelines said, the consequences could range from a 10-day suspension to firing. What would happen is the investigators would give the board a report, and it would have details about, the officer's disciplinary history and other facts relevant to guide the determination. Is this the first time this officer's done this? Is it the second or third time? What was the circumstances of the arrest? Was it something pretty minor? Was it something very significant? That kind of thing. And then the board panel would meet, they'd discuss the case, and they might vote to say, given the facts, they're going to vote to recommend a 30-day suspension. So that's how it would work in the context of a tier 1 case. Tier 2 case, let's say that PAB's investigators find that an officer was disrespectful to a citizen and it was their first time doing it. This is someone who's either pretty new to the force or they've been on the force a while, and this is the first time this has happened. And maybe it seemed like, this officer was very stressed. They were really, they were working 18-hour shift, and this was at the end of it or something. The guidelines might label this a tier 2 set of wrongdoing. And, the board might predetermine in those guidelines that the real, issue here is, it's, a one-off thing at this point. And so the consequences should be, we need a written apology from the officer just saying, I'm sorry about this. And there might be some retraining, right? This is also a great example of how the guidelines can incorporate non-punitive and restorative measures that are about saying, there's a problem and we can change it by changing the way that people do their work and changing relationships. So just in emphasizing that the boards in creating these guidelines, it doesn't have to be about punishment. It can also be about restoration. And so in this kind of case, because the guidelines label this a lower tier offense and that, there's a predetermined consequence here, PAB investigators would not have to go to a full panel necessarily. And instead, they could include a proposed this consequence right in the final report. And so that's kind of the example of how the two different tiers would work. So at the end of the day, to kind of summarize, this framework would give the board 4 discrete tasks if and until the disciplinary powers return. And I emphasize that because this framework is kind of a foundation. It's something to be built upon. And so if and when those disciplinary powers come back, these procedures would change, but they would change in ways that would seem natural. So it would not be, rebuilding from the ground up, but instead just adding some more steps, right? Bringing in that hearing process into it. And board members, by doing this process, would begin to understand and work through the basic procedures that would allow them to do that disciplinary process well too. So, the board's 4 big tasks under this framework would be first, creating and then updating those guidelines, that disciplinary matrix. The second proposed role would be to, as panels, reviewing those investigatory reports, and then meeting to discuss and determine the consequences, and then still meeting as the board on a regular basis and still meeting as committees to guide and oversee the broader work of the Police Accountability Board. In terms of hourly work, though, that first bucket, that would be, at least in the short term, probably the primary thing the board was doing. And then moving forward, the primary thing the board members would be doing would be reviewing those investigatory reports and meeting as panels to discuss and determine recommended consequences. So just to emphasize that there are 4 different roles here, but the meat of those roles over the medium term would be in the reviewing of reports and meeting as panels. So we discussed one framework that the staff has kind of pulled together and put out there. What are the alternative frameworks? There's a few, and you can kind of see them in a pyramid. And at the top of the pyramid are options that involve less time, training, and less cases for board members to look at. And at the bottom of the pyramid is more time, training, and cases for the board to look at. So, the first possible framework is the board to have no role, to, say, well, given the lawsuit, the board doesn't need to do anything. And no one I've spoken to thinks that that's necessarily appropriate, but it's of course on the table if the board, does not want to be involved in the investigatory process, does not want to make recommendations. Certainly, that's a role. Another role is to just create, but not necessarily apply guidelines. Just have that kind of, creating the disciplinary matrix without necessarily applying them, so that the board wouldn't have a caseload. The middle path here is for the panels to apply guidelines in those tier 1 cases where wrongdoing is found. So creating the guidelines and then applying the guidelines in tier 1 cases. That's the framework we just walked through. Now, you could have the board do even more work if the panels were to apply the guidelines in all cases where wrongdoing was found. So even in those cases where, say, officer was disrespectful, the board could meet as a panel to review and discuss and determine what would have to happen. But we can't be for sure knowing what the percentage of cases in tier 1 or tier 2 would be. But what we do know from other police accountability boards is that lots of those kind of disrespect cases can make up a very significant part of the docket. And so it's very likely that if the board were to choose this path, it would significantly increase their workload. And then, there's also the option that the board could decide that it would be approving the findings in all cases, then applying the guidelines. So the board would not only meet to discuss whether or not what the consequences should be in the case of wrongdoing, but they would meet to look at every single case that the board looked at, even ones where the board determined that there was not enough evidence to determine wrongdoing. The board could still meet and decide whether or not to, whether they would assess the facts, right? And you can see why that would probably dramatically increase the board's caseload, because it would require board members to be able to understand facts, law, et cetera. And of course, in the and the big picture vision of the board to do disciplinary hearings, et cetera, the board would have to do that, but it would be on a case-by-case basis, and it would be in the context of a hearing, right? Where in the context of a hearing is a way for the board to receive a ton of support in doing that work. Whereas in this framework, we don't necessarily have the hearings capability to kind of do that kind of case-specific walkthrough for board members. So this is kind of the pyramid of possibilities, and the board is trying to do a little bit of Goldilocks work here and choosing the middle path between these options. And of course, there are other possible frameworks to be broken out, but these are kind of the big 5 categories that the board could choose from. And we're happy to walk through the pros and cons of all of those, but in general, it's, you know, the more in depth the board wants to get, the more time, training, and cases the board will have to deal with. So if the board were to approve of this proposed framework, what would be next? Well, we would be setting the board and its staff on kind of a 2-track set of tasks for the next 6 months. The tasks would be kind of broken into staff and consultant work, and then work that board members would have to do with support from the board. So the things that the staff and the consultants would be doing is drafting all of the rules, policies, and procedures, everything from the investigatory steps, the rules for protecting officer due process rights, policies on information transfer, you know, how information would go back and forth between, the police department and PAB. This is important. I just want to give folks an update. Over the last year, the city has been thinking about an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, to allow the board to get the information that is entitled to under the city charter. If we're moving forward with this framework, what we've spoken to the law department about is the PAB coming up with the initial set of rules and having those go to the city for review. So the existing MOUs probably wouldn't be signed, but they would be, some of that information, some of those positions would be incorporated into the draft rules that we would come up with and work with the city to finalize. And of course, after drafting an initial set of these policies, they would go to the board. So the board could, at least be aware of that draft, take a look at that draft before we took it to the city. And of course, that next step would be working with the law department to review and, if possible, improve those rules. And then meeting with RPD to discuss and receive input. I want to emphasize, I know we probably have may have some members of RPD watching, the PAB will of course not, finalize any of these rules without receiving input from and discussing these rules with the officers who will be most involved in the rules. That just makes a lot of sense. And of course, meeting with the Locust Club to also discuss and receive input, making sure that we get as much experience and perspective from these stakeholders as possible. And then, of course, submitting a final set of rules that incorporate all the relevant expertise and perspectives to their board for their approval, because again, at the end of the day, it's the board's role to approve these things as the leaders of the agency. And then getting right to it, beginning to train the staff on these things. And so, as much as these tasks are for the next 6 months, the drafting of the rules is going to happen much quicker than that, because in that 6-month window, you also have to complete the training and onboarding and all of that. So the writing of the rules is really, what's going to be happening in the coming weeks. So this process will move as quickly as we can make it, given the fact that we have some other stakeholders who will need to be at the table. So as the staff do this work, the board will still have following tasks of receiving education and training on creating and using the disciplinary guidelines. They'll receive that training from SMK. We're just experts in this, to the extent that we need to talk to some outside advisors, we might, but really, SMK is just, Mina and Thomas and Ron are just really phenomenal about all this, particularly Mina and Ron when it comes to understanding how to create and apply these things. And then obtaining community input on the contents of guidelines. And again, the board would be supported here by our public affairs staff, community engagement people, to make sure that we had structured events and forums, et cetera, and panels to get board community member input. And then drafting that initial set of guidelines, again, with support from SIK and PAB and policy staff. And then, as the law requires, receiving input on our draft from RPD and the Locust Club with staff guidance. Again, making sure that relevant stakeholders have a voice and we hear their experiences in all this. Finalizing both the initial guidelines and the staff rules, and then beginning case review. So, by adopting this framework, the board would also be adopting this kind of 6-month vision for doing their work. And, this would be a significant amount of work for the board, even though it's over more or less a half year of work. And so if the board were to adopt this framework, it would also be adopting what would be a fairly rigorous amount of work over the next 6 months. It will really focus the board meetings, committee meetings, et cetera, around this as being the primary task of the board. And so with that, I'm, excuse me. That is the basic framework. I am happy to walk through any details. Again, we have Mina and Thomas here to also give their answers to any questions, give any perspectives. But at this point, I'm happy to take questions, Chair Wilson, if you believe appropriate. I know there's a lot to discuss.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot to discuss. So, but I think, Connor, I'm sorry, did you mention the state grant before you started this conversation? Because I know that there were some questions.
I did, Chair Wilson.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I know that we've got some, later in the meeting, we're going to be deliberating and voting on if we're going to approve this new framework, but I know we've kind of reserved this time for questions, so that's great. Go ahead and do that, please. If anybody has any questions, to go ahead and ask. It's a lot of information, I understand.
Great evening, Connor. Thank you so much for a very, very detailed presentation, very informative and well presented. This question is something that I think we can deal with readily and just get it off the table. You mentioned early in your presentation for the board to be able to open cases without complaints. What is that?
Sure. So, the board investigates potential officer wrongdoing. When someone files a complaint, that is someone saying, I think that officers did something wrong. And so we can investigate that complaint. We can investigate complaints. We can also investigate things that aren't complaints. Like if someone just has a tip and they say, hey, I'm not filing a complaint, but I think you should know, I think I saw something happen. And, I don't want to, I'm going to do this anonymously. I just want to put the information out there. We can investigate that too. That's not investigating necessarily a complaint. You could call it a complaint, but it's more of a tip. And then we can investigate things on our own. So if someone sees something in the media, the PAB can decide we aren't going to wait for someone to file a complaint or call us. We're just going to investigate. And so there's no complaint there. But again, we have the power to investigate. It's a really powerful and great thing for PAB, but it just means that, we don't only deal in complaints, though we certainly will be.
Are there any other questions?
Connor, and Chair, do we have to vote today for this plan? Only because I feel like, I would like to have the presentation itself and just kind of go over it. I feel like it's a lot to decide right now. I also want to look at the pyramid part of it of, more time, less time, that type of thing. So just wondering if we have to make a decision tonight, because I feel like I might have more questions, right? I might have a ton of questions because I'm even thinking about, tracking those that are lower level cases. How are we going to do that? Is it going to be by common actions that we are hearing constantly, that are reoccurring? I'm just trying to process all of the information.
Yeah, no, the board certainly doesn't have to approve of this framework tonight. What I will say is that, there's a bunch of common pieces to any framework that we just have to get going on anyway. So the how you do the investigations, right? there's not going to be anything we can really vote on about that because that's already in the charter, right? So starting tonight, we're going to be writing those rules anyway. I think that determining exactly the board's role, I think that the board should take a little bit of time with that, because it's a big decision, right? We don't know if and when the lawsuit's going to change things. We might be dealing with the system we adopt for a while. So of course it makes a lot of sense for the board to really sit with this, look at the presentation, email questions, if that makes the board most comfortable, of course. If the board wanted to approve it tonight, you can as well.
Thank you, Connor. At this time, board members, if you do have a question, please use the raise hand signal. I do have Dr. Harrison, then Board Member Brown, and then Chair Wilson.
Also Reverend Nicola.
Thanks. I was thinking that as you made this presentation, Connor, that this is probably not the only complex problem that the board is going to have to deal with in its existence. And it's too complex a problem to make sense out of an oral presentation. There are too many things that you have to go back to and you have to remember. And I don't know about, I can only speak for myself, but I'm just not capable of doing that in an oral presentation. So my suggestion is that you put this proposal down on paper and the board give it to the board to read and discuss at the next meeting.
Thank you, Dr. Harrison. Now I have Board Member Brown.
Yes, my question was, or is, you mentioned that for the next 6 months, the board really has to work on and develop a framework for doing its work. And that being said, does that mean that our regular committee meetings and things that we were planning, such as basic educational meetings, will be suspended while we concentrate on this?
All I will say is that at the end of the day, that's the board's decision what it will and won't suspend. But I think that it would be very difficult to focus on other things beyond this. This would really be, and what I will say this, I didn't say this in the presentation. This, if you create this disciplinary matrix, as I understand it, it will be the first time a community has created a set of guidelines for officer discipline like this. So it's not just important work for Rochester. It's really something. It's a big deal for anyone, which means that doing it appropriately takes some extra time and work. So it really would have to be. It would be the focus for the board, probably to the exclusion of some other things.
Okay, and also I didn't see, or I'm assuming that we are to develop a way for the community to have some input, because I did not see any of that in this presentation, unless I missed it.
In the guidelines, yes. So in the guidelines, yeah, that would be probably the central role of the board in creating the guidelines would be community input. So, you all would be, sitting in on those sessions and figuring out how to get people to engage with this. That would be the heart of creating these guidelines, because the more community input there is, the more seriously they'll be taken.
Thank you, Connor.
I will say that Thomas also has an answer to this one. So I'm just going to pass off to him.
So in terms of question related to the work and the role of the board, in terms of that pyramid, where it should fall, as well as whether to work on the disciplinary matrix, is going to be a critical decision. The investigation and intake will start once the investigators are prepared, trained, and process in place. But it'll end up sitting at the back end until this decision is made. And not only the decision is made, what the role of the board will be, whether to look at the cases and make recommendations for it to go to RPD chief, or go to the top tier on the pyramid and just let it bypass, or bottom tier of looking at even the decision making of whether the cases are substantiated or not. Until that decision is made, investigation will be almost complete, pending what that final piece will look like. That decision will have to come from the board. We could help in drafting and crafting it, but in terms of where the board lands in that, either middle ground, upper or bottom tier, has to be decided sometime relatively soon. It doesn't have to be tonight, based on current condition with the lawsuit, as well as what the role of the board should be. And that is something that board needs to consider, because otherwise then you will have number of cases starting and then getting suspended at the back end. So.
Thank you, Thomas. Now we're going to move on over to Reverend Nicola.
Thanks. And first off, thanks to our consultants and to Connor and our staff. I appreciate the effort to want to make sure that you honor the volunteer nature of the board members. I know there's a lot of stuff to do. We're trying to move forward as expediently as possible, and certainly it was a great presentation. I really appreciate all of it. One concern I have, and it's less of a concern with what's on the paper, and it's more about just kind of a sense I have is I could imagine community members who already are less than pleased with the way that things have gone with the board, saying now suddenly all the board gets to do is kind of like cross T's and dot I's at this end of the process, which is really run by the staff, who are, really under Connor's direction more than, say, the boards. I know that's not what your desire is, but how would you kind of narrate that to the public? I know that part of our job as board members is to be is to be involved with community education and community listening, and to be engaged with that dimension of things. So yeah, I'd be curious to hear how you narrate that now. Just imagine there's some viewers wondering that same thing, and how does this? Yeah, maybe you could say that first, and then I have a follow-up question depending on what you say.
And this is something that we've been talking about internally for weeks. Because what makes the PAB powerful is that it is community run, right? That's what makes this board powerful. At the same time, we know that the PAB has to be perceived as fair and as impartial and as sticking to the facts. And what we have seen in some other places, New York's an example, is where the facts and the evidence and the investigators, after months of looking at all the evidence, come up with what they believe happened, and then a panel of board members comes in at the end and says, we disagree. And that can have a negative effect, because you have investigators saying these are the facts, and then you have people saying no, these aren't the facts, and that's just confusing for the community. And so, and that's not to say that, if the board were having, disciplinary hearings where they were sitting as, juries and judges and listening to all the facts, and it was hours and days, that would be different. But in this process where you don't have that, it can be harder for the board to have the expertise and knowledge to be making the findings in a way that would reassure the community and officers that we're being impartial. And I'll hand it over to Thomas here, because he's done a lot of thinking about this.
So Ms. Malik and I lived through this, and I completely forgot that I used to actually present cases to the panel as a chief of investigation. And there is nothing more demoralizing than for your investigative team and then internal quality assurance and review process, and then signed off by review by the attorneys, and then ultimately by Ms. Malik, and then go to the board with mountain of evidence. And then yet, even though they have spent a lot of time, goes, well, we don't think those evidence are relevant, or these things matter, or it's black and white in terms of rules and regulation, but yet we're interpreting it this way. Not only it's not fair for the community, oftentimes it became the other way, and that is, investigation should be based on evidentiary standard, and how we investigate, looking at what occurred based on evidence and what the standards and policy and procedures states. Did they violate those things? Versus what individuals' thoughts or feelings are. So it could potentially create unfairness to the uniform officers, devastating to the community, and demoralize staff who have investigated. So, and then also create delays at the back end as well. So in order to create consistency and having trained investigators look at the policy and procedures, all of the interviews, follow-up interviews, looking at every evidence that needs to be gathered, utilizing that, and then comparing that to rules and regulations within RPD, whether those things have been violated, and then making a case that it is substantiated case based on these evidence, rule number X, Y, and Z have been violated based on this evidence. And then for the board to consider at that point, what should be the recommended discipline should be, I think would be my recommendation to examine. Certainly Chicago didn't have that, because internally we made that decision, whether a case was substantiated. We made the decision in terms of what the recommended discipline should be, and then it went to the police chief, because police chief or superintendent made the final decision. If there was a disagreement, it went to the police commission to make that arbitration aspect of it. But I think where the PAB is, we're in a good spot where board doesn't have to be the investigator or evidentiary expert, but all right, based on staff's work, now we have to decide what the guideline, what the disciplinary outcome should be, so that there's a consistency associated with it. Hopefully the laws or the legal challenge or the PAB will prevail, so that actual decision in terms of the meeting out the discipline rests there. But meanwhile, at least making that way public knows that PAB is making these recommendations, but police chief is saying, well, you know what, we are not going to discipline, or maybe he or she will say, well, we're going to go actually harsher. So yeah.
I guess I know there's a lot of questions, and thank you for that explanation, Mr. Kim. I guess the real thrust of the question, right, is I have 100% confidence in our staff. I know we'll hire great people. I love how we're going about this in terms of ensuring, right, that we get the best possible set of evidence that's based impartially and on facts and on what's happened. I guess the concern is, I wonder if there are points in, I can't remember which part of the presentation, but there's a column of what the staff need to do and then what the board needs to do. If there are places in that process where, say, when you go to talk with the police chief and with the Locust Club, if board members can be a part of that conversation as well, even just to listen and to make sure that representatives of the community are in the room, and making sure that kind of stuff. Making sure that when we communicate to the public, that it's clear that we are laying this as a foundation in the direction of anticipating winning the lawsuit down the line, so that they know that that original thrust is still honored. And then again, just again and again, any way we can take that presentation you just did and really help the public, especially when we share this publicly, to see how the PAB that they voted for is represented by this. I think obviously it makes perfect sense to me, at least as much as I understood what y'all were doing with all that information. We have great staff, we have great folks working with us, so I don't think that's in question at all. But I do think, just given that people are going to be like, oh no, they lost their discipline powers, PAB can't do anything now. how do we ensure them that this is still representing them? And I think there's, you know, and I think we'll find a way to do it. But I think it needs to be said, because the other way we could look at this again, and I anticipate, is people saying, where's the board? It's all being run by Connor and his crew, right? And I hate for any hint of that kind of division to be public. I think that that's something that is probably more of a concern than I think we've acknowledged. That I think we also need to keep building trust with the community as well as part of this process, so that they trust it that way. So I appreciate the transparency of these meetings, and just any way we can do that and make infographics or anything that we can disseminate so that it's clear how this all fits together and still is the same PAB that we've been trying to be all along would be really helpful. But thanks. I'll be quiet now.
Thank you, Reverend Nikoloff. We'll go with Chair Wilson and then Dr. Harrison.
Okay, so thank you. I think there are a lot of questions, and I think Board Member Perez really offered the suggestion of making sure that the board has as much information in front of them as possible. And I think that that is correct. And I think that there is, I believe that this is one of the biggest decisions we're going to make as a board going forward. You know, this is a turning point of the board, and I think that the board needs to make sure that they're comfortable with what that's going to look like, because you mentioned volunteers, right? And you mentioned being able to be present, because this is going to be more than just, I believe, probably a Thursday meeting. And so people have to know what this is actually going to mean, because it's going to be community outreach. It's going to be us working with Mr. Kim and Ms. Malik. It's going to be, us deliberating as a board, trying to figure out how things are going to work. So there are a lot of moving parts. This is like a machine. This is the machine. So I think that this is something that I really would like to ask that, it's 7:41. After Dr. Harrison, I'm going to ask for to consider a motion to table this until the next meeting, until we can get all of the information that we need. And I also wanted to ask Ms. Malik and Mr. Kim just about time frame with your experiences trying to build these types of disciplinary matrices and with board work, and just how that actual time frame actually looks like to you all. And then I'll that's the end of my questions, and I'll kick over to Dr. Harrison.
I think Ms. Malik could take the lead, because she was the one who pushed the disciplinary matrix, even though it took many, many years for it to be negotiated at NYPD with CCRB. So I don't know whether Ms. Malik will want to chime in. But in terms of putting one together, I think we could probably help and get it done pretty quickly, especially if it's recommended versus agreed upon by the city and RPD. That was what the issue was with NYPD versus and CCRB. Ms. Malik?
Right. So I do think that we're in a good place in terms of creating a disciplinary matrix, and with all of you on board and helping to create that, that's going to be extremely meaningful to push this process along. Obviously, as Thomas just mentioned, there are some other moving pieces here when you bring in other entities and other agencies to sort of be a part of this process and be included. But where we are right now is extremely good. And as long as I know the holidays are coming up, to the extent that we can all work together in terms of getting something on paper, something meaningful on paper, it will make a huge impact in making sure that we're on a timeline to get a disciplinary matrix in effect.
And just to piggyback off of that, the 6 months time frame, I think, is more than doable, and actually I think is generous. Granted, this is recommended and it's adopted by PAB, but if it needs to be negotiated with police union and RPD for it to be standardized, then that's a different story. So.
And just to the law says that we need to have the input of the Locust Club and the city, the RPD, but they do not need to finalize. There's no vote from them. There's no, they can't hold it up.
My turn. As an aside, given the present circumstances, we probably need to come up with some name other than disciplinary. But I raised my hand in response to Mr. Kim's concern about disagreement between boards and investigators. I think that's a healthy sign, Mr. Kim. That's called peer review where I come from. Scientists, given molecules and exact analyses and everything, can still come up with two different answers to the same question. So you can't get around it. Peer review is the gold standard.
Absolutely agree. I wasn't implying that peer review is not needed, but building that in the internal process and then having the board decide. So in that pyramid matrix, if the board decides on the bottom one, and that is board wanting to look at everything, and then investigation is passed on with just the evidence aspect of it, and then board deciding whether it's substantiated or not. Those are the board decisions where in that pyramid it needs to land. And I think ultimately that's where the decision will have to be. So
I agree. I just had to push you a little bit on the peer review side.
If I may add, I think that, perhaps the board should also be mindful if down the road, the board members might want to be involved in issue-based reports. For example, if you see a pattern in practice of chokeholds or search and seizures, illegal searches and seizures, or illegal use of tasers, right? Then that's where the board can really make an impact and step in and publish an issue-based report, which will be extremely meaningful to the public because it shows all the great work that the board is focused on and doing in evaluating these cases, and not just churning out decisions on cases, but actually analyzing and reviewing these cases so that they can turn out meaningful reports like that. And also community-based education, I think, is another place that the board can be very, very involved in down the road by going out to the communities, particularly those communities that are very impacted by police misconduct. So that's another area that I think is extremely important and meaningful.
The last thing I wanted to suggest that the issue be tabled with expectation of a written proposal.
Yeah, and what I'll just say to that, Bob, is that I'd hope that I know that the written proposal is going to have a fairly fair-handed breakdown of the pros and cons of the different options, and I do think that, what guides a lot of this is concern about board time, because one thing we really are concerned about is you launch these cases and you go 90 days, 100 days, 3 months, and people aren't hearing anything because there is just this huge bottleneck. And balancing that versus what I think is a really serious concern about making sure, again, that people feel like what the PAB is saying is coming from the community. If I had a magic wand, we'd do it all. But the volunteer board member statuses.
Connor, I'm asking for help with my disability. When I find that I can't remember how the sentence started, and it still hasn't ended yet, then I know I need something written. My memory just doesn't work that well, so that's all I'm doing.
It's coming your way, I promise.
I'm done, Danielle.
Awesome. Well, thank you, guys. I just make a motion that we table this discussion to next meeting.
I'll go ahead and second that.
Great. Discussion is tabled. Chair Wilson, if you want to go to the next item on the agenda.
Okay, so you actually have to call a vote. So yep. So all in favor of tabling the discussion about the next step of the PAB working on the disciplinary matrix and the involvement of the board and the next steps. Okay. Oh, okay. Before the vote is called, it looks like Dr. McIntosh has a statement question. No? Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm still getting used to this hand thing. Okay, so all in favor of tabling? Okay, all right, so moved. All right, thank you, everyone. Sorry about the hands. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. So I just have the chair's report to briefly explain. Tuesday, we met with City Council, and Connor and SMK gave a wonderful presentation to City Council about exactly what we're explaining tonight. They had a lot of great questions. Councilmember Melendez really was concerned about next steps and what is going to happen if we need to do more after the three-tiered phases that had been discussed by SMK. And so, I think that, I think that the three tiers or the three phases are pretty much what we have going on so far. And I think that City Council seemed overall pretty pleased with what they heard. And so that was reassuring to me. The SMK gave a great presentation. And I think that the takeaway is that what President Scott said, which is, we're looking for, the Cadillac example, which I really loved, was, Cadillac with all the bells and whistles, but really we need something that runs well, right? We want a well-oiled machine. And then Mr. Kim talked about the Tesla, which I'm not sure everybody got, but most of them did. Tesla 2.0 or Cadillac 2.0, I don't know, but who loves cars? But either way, it's that we're building a brand new system. And so I think that City Council really got that. I will go ahead and provide the YouTube video and send it to the board of the meeting. And we will also, if there are any other additional questions, just because for the sake of time, I want to move on. Unless anybody has any questions about the actual meeting itself. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to any committee reports. And I do not have any reports from committee. And so unless there are any objections, I'm going to move on to the unfinished business. Okay. So folks, at the last meeting, we resolved to come up with a plan for getting meetings scheduled with Lead Peak Performance. We spoke with Lead Peak and they're able to set meetings past the end of the year. They've come up with a proposed meeting calendar, and I'm going to ask our executive director to come up with the meeting, show the meeting times to the board, please.
Here we go. Let me just share my screen. And as far as, I just want to say this, the staff did a check on December 9th and it did not appear to be a high holiday. So. These are all Thursdays. They're either the second or fourth Thursday of a month.
Okay. Sorry, folks. I have too many screens open here. Apologies. Okay.
Madam Chair, do you want a motion to approve the schedule?
I guess I wanted to make sure that we were okay with the schedule, because I know that there were some questions about the December 2nd versus the 9th. And so if nobody has any questions, then I'll take the motion to approve.
I'll make a motion to approve the schedule.
I'm sorry, can I look at the calendar again?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Make it easier.
Okay.
So is the 24th would only be will not be if we meet the 11th, but if we don't meet the 11th of November, then we would meet the 24th, correct?
Yes.
What?
Can you repeat that, Board Member Perez?
Well, what I'm understanding is that if we meet on the 11th, then we don't have to extend it to the 24th. But if we don't meet on the 11th, then we have to go for the 24th of February. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so we did. Yep. So we will have to go ahead. And I know that there are also Mondays that are also available. And that was when we looked at the Google form, that some people were available on Mondays, but not everyone. Dr. McIntosh?
Okay, so I'm just trying to understand this list because November 11th, we have a speaker coming. Let me just double check my.
You don't know how.
Which had been discussed previously at another meeting. And that date was picked because November 4th, I had to cancel the speaker because the decision was made again to go to the first and the third Thursday. So I switched upon this board's request for the speaker to come on the 11th. So the current calendar that you have, what would you like me to do at this point? Because that date's already given.
Maureen?
If you do have a conflict for any date, if you could just let me know, as a whole. We did talk to Lead Peak and, based on the Google form that I had sent out and that everyone had sent back, we do have Mondays as an alternative date. So send me, if there's any issues with any conflict of any of the dates that are on there, just let me know ASAP so we can get it rescheduled for a Monday.
Yeah, I mean, it's a conflict because I mentioned this in our last meeting that I would switch it to November 11th for the speaker since we were going to have a meeting on the 4th.
Okay, so the
So, yeah.
11th is not, you have the speaker confirmed for the 11th? Okay.
Yep.
I'm gonna make note of that right now, and then we will get that scheduled to either the Monday before or the Monday after.
Or we keep the 24th, the February 24th, because that was the alternate date.
Okay, you can, that's fine as well. As long as there's no conflict for anyone on the 24th, we can do that as well.
Okay.
It falls on a Thursday.
So just to clarify, so as of right now, I am not scheduling any more speakers after November until I get notification from the chairs of this board when to restart that.
Correct.
Correct.
I know Mr. Kim and Ms. Malik have to go. Thank you so much for coming.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Have a
Bye-bye.
wonderful night, everyone.
Take
You
care.
too, thank you.
Okay. Bye. Okay, so I'm glad for those that alternative date. And I know that Lead Peak has been really great about being able to push into the new year. And so I'm sure that they'll be able to work with us. And even if we have to push into March, I'm sure that they'd be able to talk with us. So I know, and it's not been discussed with them. I hope I'm not putting words in their mouth, but I'm sure we can speak to them about doing that. So, okay.
And just one thing, will that be sent out? The dates be sent out with the minutes?
Green?
Yes.
Yes? Okay.
Yeah, we can get that
Great.
sent out with the minutes.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay.
All right, Chair, you want to go to the next part in the
Yes.
agenda?
Yep. Okay. So now we're going to move on to new business. I know we have 3 items of new business on the agenda. I know, well, actually 2 items on the agenda since we are tabling the discussion about the policy and procedure framework. But I think we are going to talk about some of the things that Dr. Harrison wanted to discuss. I'll give you the floor to discuss the first item, which is proposal to produce video advertisements regarding how community members should interact with the police.
Well, it's actually a 2-part suggestion in one way. I'm not a creative person, so I can't really give you a scenario or a vision of what it would be like, but it just seemed to me that there are certain circumstances, car stops would be one of them, that where interaction with police is common and bad things frequently happen, that are to some extent avoidable based on just a clear understanding of who you are and where you are, and what you can and cannot do. So I had an idea of public service ads that would show these scenarios with perhaps a voiceover explaining what was being done or what was not being done. I don't actually know the guy real well, but I know that there's a videographer named Carvin Eisen, Eisen or O-N, I forget which, who has a faculty position out at Brockport and does a lot of work with Garth Fagan and the like. I sent a copy of his curriculum vitae, I think, to Connor, and I thought it would be interesting to talk with him and find out how much it would actually cost to produce a series like that. I don't see anybody nodding.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know, I guess the only thing I would say is that I know that after the protest last year, after actually the 9-year-old, that there were some community interest in doing a PSAs, or at least discussions on how to be safe when you are filming police officers. And so, or people intimidation. And so I just wanted to offer that as well. It's just as I know you wanted to think about that. So I just wanted to offer that.
And I could see,
Thank you.
Bob, what we heard, or Dr. Harrison, what we heard about before of issue-based kind of reports, or any of this stuff we're talking about, finding anybody to help make some visual and or non just written kind of bulky stacks of paper that we could distribute to the public would be great. So, I mean, I'd be interested in learning more with it when we're at that point. Could see that as a good overlap.
Board Member Perez?
Yeah, I'm just curious, how much would that cost? How often will they be, depending on where it's going to be shown? Is it on TV? How is that going to work? How much does that cost? Because I know just by working at the radio station, the more you want it to run, the more costly it's going to be. My other concern would be, are we going to do it in multiple languages, including sign language, which can also raise the cost of that? I think there's just, not that it's a bad idea, I just think that it's going to be very costly. And is that where we want to spend our money?
Dr. Harrison, did you want to respond?
Just that I don't know the answer to that. And those are the kind of questions I would expect us to have if we were to have someone like Eisen come and talk about it. But I don't know the answer to those questions.
Okay.
And I'm satisfied. That's all that I wanted to do in terms of presentation. What was the other thing?
Yeah, I wasn't expecting an answer either. I was just saying, those are the things you got to think about, right?
Yeah.
So not that I was expecting you to answer those questions.
I agree.
So, so thank you, Dr. Harrison, for bringing at least that that proposal to the floor, but I guess, do you want to make a motion for the staff to start exploring these options or for the board to, would you like to do that? I guess I'm asking.
Not necessarily, no.
Okay. All right. Just something to throw out there. Okay. All right. So I know you had one more thing that you wanted to discuss. Oh, I think it was, I keep going back to state grants for some reason. I know that's not what you wanted to do for new business, though.
Demographic breakdown of new
yes.
hires.
There you go. Thank you. Thank you, Vice Chair. Dr. Harrison? Floor is yours.
Yeah. I think that it should be a routine that we have a report on the demographics of the PAB staff.
Okay. Does anybody want to discuss that further? And is that a motion, or do you?
Well, to expand on that just a little bit.
Yeah.
We're anticipating that a very high percentage of the complainants coming to the PAB are going to be Black and brown people. And logic says that we want to have staff that matches them more or less. That's at least what I think. And that's why I think that knowing the demographics will be useful.
Vice Chair.
I would be interested in seeing how does that play legally and with the law, and what we are allowed to do and what we are allowed to ask individuals.
Well, the demographics for the police department are published, so I assume that you can do it.
That's a good point. Definitely, I understand you want the staff to be representative.
I'm not saying that is used as a way of making hiring decisions. I'm saying that it's a post hoc analysis of what happened.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Executive Director.
I believe the city tracks that, Board Member Harrison. So it should be fairly straightforward to get that after the fact hiring information if people want to know about the diversity of our employees.
Dr. Harrison, what do you think?
Well, have we hired anybody else?
No.
So we're still at whatever the demographics say for the present, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So I guess I would ask that everybody at least consider entertaining a motion that that we should request the demographics from the city after we do our first and second wave of hires, and do an examination and discuss it in an open meeting. So if that sounds good to everyone, then I'll ask for a second, please.
Chair Wilson, before you ask for the motion,
Sure.
it perhaps, because I had to dash away for a moment, maybe I missed something. But after everyone has been hired and the staff is established, isn't that a little late to find out or to look at what the demographics are? Or is that illegal to kind of, I don't know how this works, but if you have already hired all of the people and then you look at the demographics of your staff and say, oops, well, this doesn't reflect the community. Wow, we still have, but they're already hired and therefore they're there. I don't know how this works. This is all brand new to me. If someone can explain it so it makes sense, it would be very helpful.
Executive Director.
Board Member Brown, our plan was to, after the first 10 hires, have the demographic information. And so you would be 25% of the way through. And so that would be kind of a pause point to make sure that the board was doing all it could in terms of diverse recruitment.
Yeah, I do think it's a good idea to take a look at, the staff outreach when it comes to, and how effective was it? And I think that would be something that the board could examine, Board Member Brown. And so that's why I asked that a motion be considered to examine that data and then take a look at it after the second wave of hires.
That's
I second
different from
that
what
motion.
Connor- That's different from what Connor says.
Is it?
The first 10 is not, is sooner than your standard.
Okay, so what would be the recommendation when the board should examine that data?
I would like to change the motion to
Okay,
reflect Connor's plan to do the demographics after each 10 hires.
okay. So there's a motion now that has been amended to reflect what the executive director said, which is that we examine the demographic data after the first 10 hires.
After each 10 hires.
After each 10 hires. So that, okay, so I guess
So-
I will leave it there. Oh, go ahead. I'm Board Member Perez.
So after each 10 hires, to do what? Like, once you hire them, to ensure that those demographics are different for the next hire? Because going back to Board Member Brown's point, what's the point after they're hired? So with the purpose of what? So once you do a wave of hire and you look at the demographics, maybe they're weighing more to one side with the purpose of what? To balance that out? Because otherwise, then I agree with Board Member Brown. What's the purpose of doing it after they're hired? Once you hire them, you can't change it. So I guess after the wave, examine it after a wave of hiring to do what? To change it, to make sure that you're hiring another different demographic. Like, I feel like there's something missing there.
I agree there's something missing, but I don't think that, I think that it's okay that there's something missing.
And I think that it's okay to hire the most qualified person. Like we've done before.
I guess, so there is a motion on the floor, everyone. It is to look at every 10 hires. And so since it's on the floor, then I'm going to ask for a second, or is the motion defeated? Okay, so motion is not going to, the motion is defeated. Okay, so we also do have another motion as well, which was mine, which was, and I just wanted to ask that be considered to actually examine the data after all the hires are finished. I think it'd be important, Board Member Perez, because I really want to see what the staff has done as far as what their outreach looks like. How effective was the outreach? Did it actually reach the target demographic that we were looking for? And so I think that really would be important for the board to examine, because at least we can say to the staff, here's what worked well and here's what didn't work well. And I think that would be really helpful going forward. And so I know that's kind of long-winded, but that I would ask for a motion for that to be considered, or second, sorry.
I second that motion.
Okay, so all in favor of asking for the demographic data from the city after the first and second wave of hires second wave of hires at the end, to examine the demographic data to see how effective the staff's outreach was to specific demographics, to make sure that our folks are represented, or folks that look like the city residents represented. All in favor? Okay, and me, so 4, and then all opposed? Any abstentions? 2, okay, so 4 and 2. Oh, Board Member Brown, what was your vote? We're,
Abstention.
okay, so we had 3 abstentions, we had 4 in favor. All right, so motion does carry. Okay, all right. So I think, folks, that is all we have for tonight. So we have, to recap, for the to-dos for next time, we did table the motion, the biggest thing we're dealing with today, but also we have Maureen looking to send the board the new meeting dates to make sure that that's all set, along with the minutes as requested by Dr. McIntosh. And so we will be looking forward to that in the next couple of days. And so then, and you guys are going to get a kick out of this one, I am going to, now that the big business is complete, I'm going to ask for a motion to adjourn the meeting.
A motion.
Motion that we adjourn the meeting.
Okay, and I need a second.
I second.
Thank you. I need a second. Okay, all right. All in second. All right, all in favor of ending, we're done. Okay.